All right, listeners. Well, you're probably noticing there's a different background, different environment, and even a different guest than normal. Don't worry, you are on the Digging Deeper podcast. We are excited. This is actually our last Digging Deeper of 2021. We are going to take a little Christmas break. Yeah, so we're ending with you, ending with the best.
What an honor.
You might recognize the guest to my right. It's my dear friend, Nicole. She was on a few months ago with Nicole Goens, also known as your sister.
Right.
And Florence Nikas.
Yeah.
As you guys did a great podcast on anxiety.
Oh, thanks. It was fun.
You're back. You are back here with us. How are you doing today?
Good. I feel a little relieved that I was welcomed back on the podcast.
Yes.
I'm glad I wasn't kicked off for eternity, talking about mental illness.
And ironically, I will always remember the date of your last podcast because I believe you recorded the morning that our baby was born.
Yeah,
so.
I remember that. I even think we talked about it.
Yes, yeah, you guys mentioned it because I was listening this morning just to remember what you guys talked about, and it was fun because I was like, oh yeah, I remember what I was doing that day.
Special day.
I wasn't on the podcast. I was here. So you're like, okay, we have Nicole back on. Nicole, you are a therapist here in Grants Pass.
Yeah.
So just a quick disclaimer before you really lock in for the next 60 minutes. We are talking about mental health, mental illness, but anxiety was kind of the focus of your last podcast. And while it's impossible to really differentiate anxiety from mental health, mental illness, we are going to take a different route. So if anxiety is more what you are wanting to tune into, I would suggest hitting the pause button, going back on our page, going like 12 episodes back. You'll find Unpacking Anxiety. It's with Natalie, Nicole, and Florence. Start there because it's a good podcast. Listen to it this morning. It was very well done. But we're going into mental illness, so I'm excited. Got a lot of questions I'm throwing at you. It's going to be a little back and forth. I think this is like the second time I've just ever done an interview with one person. So you're going to be needing to carry a lot of the work here today, and I hope you're cool with that.
I didn't know that.
All I do is just sit here and look pretty and just drink whatever's in front of me. So
you typically are mediating between a few people.
So we can pretend like you can pretend someone's to my left and be like, "What do you think?" But they're not going to say anything. So
right on.
All right. Well. It's actually fascinating. So Nicole and I, obviously, we've talked about this a little bit before. And in my mind, there has always been this stereotype, stigma, myth, or what you may call it, that mental illness spikes in the holidays. And so my first question to you, is there a correlation between mental illness and the holidays? Fact or fiction, why or why not?
Yeah, super good question. It definitely would make sense to think that mental illness would spike around the time of the holidays or during the winter, typically like a darker season or a more emotional season. It could be. But actually, that's not, it's actually a myth that mental illness spikes during the holidays and during the winter. It usually spikes around springtime. And there's a few theories about that, but one of the biggest theories, because we don't know for a fact why that happens, but one of the biggest theories is people kind of shut off during the winter seasons and it gets colder and people kind of stay home. They kind of hunker down. The holidays also can be stressful, and when stress gets really high, we kind of go into self-protective mode or just shut down mode. And then when the spring comes around, we call it crisis season in the mental health field. It's like when people start to awaken to their emotions and their pain, or they're on the back end of hunkering down through the holidays, and that's when we see mood cycles go higher, mania is higher, and there's even more suicides during that season. So yeah, it's actually a myth. Fun fact.
Wow. Yeah, no, there were certain things in life where I was like, oh yeah, because I've had conversations with people before. I used to work at a video poker lounge for a restaurant.
Wait, really?
Well, I wasn't the video poker specialist. Worked for the restaurant.
I think we need to stop and talk about Tim's first job.
But it was fascinating and very sad because there I am working the morning shift, so it's noon in a little video poker lounge, and this lady's talking about how holidays always remind her husband passed away of cancer. And somebody was kind of picking her brain, and she was like, yeah, I'm either gambling or putting a bullet in my head. That's what I do in the winter. And crazy. I was just like, I don't know if I'm supposed to do something here or not. But
yeah. Well, and I can imagine There's a lot of grief around the time of the holidays, a lot of firsts. So like my first time without my grandma, my first time without my spouse, or some people have a lot of tragedy that happens around the holidays. And definitely I think there can be a lot of pain in that season for sure.
I mean, holidays and memories, for sure.
Yeah. Most loved ones.
So on top of that, and I don't think we're going to talk about the impact of COVID-19 too much, but are you, and I guess theoretically we've already done this one calendar year, but are we seeing any spike in, I guess what would be that springtime spike? Are we going to see anything different due to the impact of COVID-19? Or is it all just going to be just a mess anyways?
Yeah. So in 2020 and even going into 2021, it was just a lot of people seeking counseling all the way through. There wasn't really any like one particular like really huge spike that happened in 2020. It just seemed like things stayed steady. And I think things started to really get really heavy. A lot of mental health. We've seen a lot of people seeking counseling right now since COVID has started to come to an end. So a lot more people seeking counseling right now. The field is flooded. A lot of people are needing counseling. I think here in Josephine County, most counselors are on a wait list. Mental health organizations like Options, I think, has a really big wait list. Not a wait list, but just a lot of people waiting to have an assessment done to see a counselor. So I think right now that has sort of plateaued, but there's still a lot of people seeking mental health counseling right now.
All right, so that actually leads right into my next question perfectly. I'm just going to kind of send it your way, let you run with it.
Okay.
What type of healing do people in this day and age, right here in 2021, what type of healing do people in this day and age need?
Such a good question. And I think 100% right now what people need is face-to-face connection. If we look at our social media presence and we look at how everything is, a lot of our society right now is online. There's more virtual jobs, which is really helpful for a lot of people who can't leave the home. It's not necessarily always a bad thing, but we're missing out on that face-to-face connection. I mean, we actually have these cells called mirror cells that mirror, like us right now we're talking, we're taking on each other's emotional state. We can mirror each other, know in a sense what we're feeling. It helps foster empathy and connection. And without that, then we start to feel more isolated and disconnected and even emotionally disconnected as people. And when we experience that, mental illness we're way more susceptible to it.
Okay. Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, so have you seen improvements regarding how we, whatever the appropriate word would be, handle, battle, deal with our awareness towards mental illness? Are you seeing like improvements in society regarding that, or is it just such a big chasm that there's so much of everything?
Yeah, I mean, it gets really tricky. I would say there's like in a lot of areas, there's a lot more technology to help with like medical things. There's also a lot more research right now about how to work with trauma and research into what are helpful treatments or approaches for different mental illnesses. So there's a lot of great research out there. And at the same time, I think we're seeing those used more, but there's also so much more mental health issues skyrocketing, and there's so much more happening right now that with all the people seeking treatment, it makes it hard to know, like, okay, is all this actually helping? And then a lot of, I think, therapists or people in the mental health field are feeling overworked.
Oh, yeah.
And not knowing, like, maybe even getting burned out themselves or experiencing their own mental health issues. So, Yes, and it's also, I mean, to answer your question, yes, but it does get tricky.
Right. So I guess, and we're going to talk a little bit about the transformations of mental health, but it seems like we are improving in awareness and we are improving in our attack, but also the enemy, mental illness, is improving as well.
Yeah, like a classic example right now is now we do a lot of telehealth. So we can have therapy in your home if you want to have a phone conversation or a video conversation.
Yeah.
At the same time, you're missing out on that face-to-face connection that's so important.
Right.
So not to discount teletherapy, but it does really help some people, and it has helped people. At the same time, it's missing out on that face-to-face connection.
Because even part of your job and your training might be to read my body language in response.
Yeah.
How are you? Oh, I'm good. Okay, so based on your eye twitching, how are you really? Where on a phone, I could probably mask something pretty good.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I really have no idea what your facial expression is telling me right now.
Okay. Right.
So.
All right, so kind of another question coming out of that, and this was actually brought up by my wife, Rachel. You're a good friend. Who has just, whether it's through her own personal growth, walking alongside you as you've worked in therapy, just how her mind has maybe changed about therapy. So my question to you is, what would you say to somebody who has a negative view of therapy? I think there's definitely stigmas out there. I know you guys in your previous podcast talked about the stigmas of mental illness, but almost more like having to go to therapy is having to admit you're weak and you can't handle your problems on your own, whatever you might say. So what would you say to somebody who has a negative view on therapy in general?
Yeah, man. So many people have had really painful experiences with therapy, like really bad experience. And I totally get it. If it's just not a good fit with your therapist, then a therapist could say one thing wrong and just, it's so easy to be like, peace out, I'm not coming back.
Like a first impression with any relationship, right? You're meeting a new friend, they say something, you're like, nope. A dating relationship, nope, not for me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, think about it. You're walking into therapy maybe for the first time, so much anxiety in that moment. I remember the first time I went to therapy, I was like, there's something wrong with me, and what am I doing? Like, I can't believe I'm here. Now I'm like, therapy's great. Everybody should have it. But if you're in that moment and then it just doesn't click with your therapist, or your therapist, encourages you to do something that you're not comfortable with, or they say something that offends you, then it can make it hard to want to go back. But I definitely want to hear, before I go into more about this, I actually kind of want to throw this back at you. What do you think, like in your experiences or in talking to Rachel, what do you think maybe deters people from therapy in your experience?
Oh, man. So what would deter somebody from therapy? I would have to say, if I had to submit one answer, it is the stereotype of maybe coming from a male perspective, and again, very generalizing of no, I got this. I would say that's it. I got this. I can figure it out. There's so much on WebMD or therapy or therapy.com.
Don't look on WebMD.
Right. Yeah, no, saying that sarcastically, of course. But and I know for me, there's pride in not so much in downplaying what a therapist does, but almost no, I can do this. Almost like you're trying to give yourself a hip hip hooray parade or something, no, I can do this. And then it just takes a little bit of taking down that wall of being okay, I can do this. I can do this with a therapist and somebody who is trained in unpacking and untangling my brain, because I'm not. So if I had to submit one answer, somebody having negative light, it's interesting because you actually referenced somebody having a bad experience with therapy. That would be the number one. In my mind, it's people not even going in the door in the first place because they feel like they don't need to. Which, that's not a role that I step into. I'm obviously very pro. I've had some counseling, and Rach and I learned very early, even as a married couple, do preventative counseling. So
that's
meeting
great.
with counselors before there's a problem, not to create a problem, but if you're able to unpack log jams before they're huge log jams, it works really well.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I would say a lot of the times I want to add that I think sometimes people encourage therapy for like one person in the family that looks like they have like all the issues. Like, oh, you need to be in therapy.
Right.
You know, and it's really easy to overlook my own need for therapy when I can point the finger at the person with the biggest issues. Yeah. But something that I'm more trained in, and the type of therapy that I think is actually the most beneficial is when you bring the whole family in. And I know you and Rachel have done like premarital, marital stuff, preventative care in your relationship. And I actually wonder how like going together has helped both of you in your own mental health.
Yeah, good, because I think you're having those, I mean, there's times where, you know, counselors are there and we're having the conversation, or the other cool part is getting to watch your spouse unpack something as well, and you're sitting there being able to take notes and then them doing the same. So side note, when you have a whole family in there, is your first thing like, I'm going to identify the person that suggested other people need this and zero in on them?
I can't give away my tactics online.
Right, okay, that's right.
No, I'm kidding. Yeah, I mean, whoever's pointing the finger, there's obvious what we call projection in there, that I'm reacting to the things that I don't like in myself that I see in you. I'm reacting to those. And when I see those, it scares me that you may have those. And so I'm going to point the finger when it's really like my own issues.
Right.
It kind of gets complicated, but we do that a lot in a family. So, but yeah, everybody plays a role in a family, and it's helpful to know what those roles are, and then to see, are those roles necessary, and are they actually helping the people with the mental health problems in the family?
Okay. Okay, a question that was on my mind that I want to throw, it came up while we were talking. Is there such a person out there who maybe you could say wholeheartedly doesn't need therapy at all? Like, would there be anybody that could actually fit the bill? It's like, you know what? In no way, shape, or form would therapy actually do you help right now, like as a compliment. Does that person exist? Or do you think to some degree everybody on this earth could benefit from walking into a counselor's office?
Yeah. Wow. Good question. I've actually never thought about that.
The answer is me. No.
Jesus.
Right.
I think that in our fallen world, everybody could benefit from a little bit of therapy in their life.
Okay.
I think that to say there's one or two people on the planet who wouldn't need therapy, there's a lot of people that do well in life without therapy, and they do fine. Could they do, I don't want to say do, could they be more holistic and well-rounded people with the right type of therapy? I think so.
Yeah. So some people are going to walk into a therapist's office or a counseling office and have their lives dramatically reformed and changed. Other people, it might be a small fine-tuning, like bringing your car to the mechanic. There's probably going to be, like, even if it's just changing a spark plug.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think we can do, I think there can be, therapy more broad. Like, we have lay counselors at the church, talking with somebody like Tawny, who's been on podcasts in the past. I would consider that a type of therapy. It's more of a spiritual type of therapy. And that is looking at our emotional well-being as Christians, our emotional well-being as people. And hey, there may be some things that I can unpack, even if I didn't experience any trauma growing up, or even if I grew up in a stable, loving family. There's still ways I can benefit and improve as a person and as a Christian. And I think everybody goes through life adjustments.
Right.
And life adjustments oftentimes bring a lot of stress. So there's two types of stress that affect us as people. There's vertical stressors and there's horizontal stressors. And vertical stressors are the type of stressors that are typical and expected. So leaving the home, starting a family, things like like buying a new house or starting a new career. Like those are healthy stressors to have, and there's still adjustments. And then there's those horizontal stressors that we just are unexpected. Like you have a car accident, or somebody in the family suddenly dies, or you get a medical condition. And a lot of times those are stressors that we can't really expect, that can blindside us, and that we may need some more help to learn, like, hey, how do I adjust to these things? Yeah.
All right. Well, on that topic of kind of the healing that people need, and you mentioned even in the church a little bit. So I was reading some articles gearing up for this, and it led me to the question is there a line or a balance between being too sensitive to mental health and being insensitive to mental health? Kind of unpacking when I was reading about athletes and mental illness, which is hopefully something we might be able to get to at the end of this. A lot of them said they were forced to kind of like suck it up. So is there like, yep, you need this, like everyone has mental illness, oh, you have anxiety, oh, you have this, like overdiagnosing, and that, oh, suck it up, you're fine. Like, where's that line or that balance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this kind of ties into what you were saying a little bit earlier. You were talking about things that maybe deter people from therapy. If I were to say in the church, I would think it's this, you're being too sensitive critique. Like, therapy means you're not, praying enough, or you don't have a strong enough relationship with the Lord, or you're relying on a pagan thing, like therapy being something that's bred, maybe not necessarily out of like Christian roots. Psychology not being bred necessarily out of Christian roots, but very much so it has a lot to do with who we are as people, and I think the Lord is using it. So I'm kind of tying that into answering this question, but I think they're two sides of the same coin. I think that like if somebody is like too sensitive to somebody's mental well-being and maybe coddles them, then it can make some people want to be like overly insensitive,
right,
and not coddle, and then that will make other people want to be more sensitive, and I think they're like kind of working against each other in a way. So yes, I think there is a healthy balance, and I think the people that are maybe too sensitive can learn, how can I be how can I call people maybe to more of how can I encourage people more to, and empower people more, and help them be more responsible for themselves. And I think how, people that are maybe too insensitive can learn that, hey, being empathetic and being sensitive to another person's like emotional well-being is not going to coddle them, and it's not going to kill them. And in fact, like, it may help them quite a bit. So learning how to come to the center.
Right. It's interesting because you see that in human relationships a lot, maybe even like a romantic relationship where one feels the need to overcompensate for the other person. Oh, you're worrying too much, so I'm not going to worry at all. Or you do this, so I'm not going to do that. And, but just kind of, but then there's a misunderstanding of the topic altogether. So
what do you see more in the church, like working in a church setting?
Oh, I mean, I think it kind of depends where you look. I mean, I think you can see both pretty well. If I had to guess, although I think we're moving to kind of a healthy understanding, but I feel like we probably were in the realm of like, you're fine, like being maybe more insensitive, insensitive, or not even really like diagnosing it well, or kind of calling it a different name or something, and. Sounds terrible, but like throwing prayer at it, kind of like, because like, as a church leader and as an untrained person, like I'll pray for you. That's my number one. Like that's obviously what I'm gonna do. But sometimes that's like my only tool in the belt, and that's just what some of us are geared for. We're like, we're untrained. I think we talk about that in a little bit as well. But I think maybe insensitivity, but I think we're getting better. Yeah,
I'm curious if you think that's more. When you say we, are you talking more about the leadership in the church or the church workers?
I would say church workers in general, and maybe not even just at River Valley, but in the community, church leadership. I think we at River Valley, I know we're having a strong, we want to be culturally relevant. Obviously, real and relevant is one of our core values. That's a shameless plug. And in that, I think we're starting to understand like mental illness and awareness of that, which is really helping us keep, I think, that barometer in the middle.
Yeah.
But yeah, church leadership as a whole, maybe in our community, it seems like there was an insensitivity or an ignorance. I would actually maybe say ignorance more than insensitivity of just realizing what it is. But I would hate to speak. Yeah, again, I say that cautiously because I don't want to speak for, because right now in my head, I can even think of just individuals on both sides of it.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to name those names. That, along with Nicole's tactics, that's on the pay to subscribe, $10. Then you'll get that. It's coming up next.
Right.
So, and we kind of addressed this in the last question, but I think it's an answer of its own. Kind of moving on. Have you seen a transformation in mental health, let's say, over the decades? Granted, you've only been on the earth for a few decades.
Right.
But just even in your research, like from the 40s, 50s, 60s, like to now, have you seen a transformation of mental health over those decades?
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating. I kind of want to nerd out. If you want to know more about the transformation in the psychology field, I could talk your ear off for a while. It started off with seeing really experimenting with the individual, like in the early 1900s, and trying to see mental illness. We could look back in like the Stone Ages when they throwing rocks through people's skulls to try to escape the the demons or whatever that were inside the brain, which we realize nowadays that's not really.
Or throw somebody, tie them to a cinder block, and if they float, they're a witch. But if they died, they weren't a witch, so we're good. Right.
We don't do that anymore. But it started off with the individual. There's something up and something wrong with them, and it may have been because their mothers were too cold, which they've disproved nowadays. But then they started moving more into let's look at the family aspect of it. This is in the 50s and 60s. There was a lot of theorists that were saying, let's move away from the individual and let's start looking at the family and how what does a family with a member who has mental illness look like, and why is that the case? And then they started later, which is more nowadays, looking more into let's look at both. Let's look at the individual's story in the context of a family system and help them learn how to rewrite their story. And so now we're in this phase of let's help the individual who's going through mental illness or having mental health issues. Let's help them rewrite their story in a new way. So it's definitely transformed between moving away from the individual to the family, and now we want to incorporate both the family and the individual. But I think in our society right now, there's so much anxiety that has come from the past few generations. If we look a few generations ago, we had a lot of wars and a lot of PTSD that came from those wars, and then they had kids. And we see anxiety pass through genetics to the third and fourth generation, which is also kind of biblical, which is fascinating. But nowadays we see a lot of people with anxiety, and there's a lot of neglect in today's society. If there's one issue that's killing our kids, it's neglect. So biggest issues right now are neglect and anxiety, and with COVID, with a lot of disconnect from face-to-face relationships right now, we're just seeing it's more normal right now for our adolescents to be having anxiety than not. So it seems more like a trend.
Right.
And so if we add the family piece to that, we've got generations of anxiety from trauma from the wars. And now we have kids that are experiencing neglect and experiencing anxiety and disconnect from a lot of societal relationships. So there's a relational issue right now. So I don't know if that makes sense, that trend, but.
No, definitely. Okay, so kind of a question I was pondering, hypothetical, we touched base on a little bit before this. could we ever see a life without mental illness?
Oh, man.
Or almost, and then the second layer, a place where your profession is no longer needed. I don't know if that's the same question or two different questions, but answer either one.
Oh, my goodness. Man, I mean, we live in a fallen world. So what I mean by that for the listeners is that, like, our human bodies aren't perfect. So I think there will always be mental illness. I kind of like to think of mental illness as like on a continuum. So like at the most severe, we have like people who experience, heavy traumas, psychosis, and, we see, people that, having delusions, just disconnected from reality. And maybe at the lowest level of that is like, I have little anxieties about people pleasing, or lowest level of that being like, I am scared that if I open up to people that they're gonna like not want to be my friend anymore, some anxieties about abandonment or rejection. And so all of us can have like some sort of taste of mental health symptoms. Like all of us experience some symptoms like, insomnia or like lack of appetite at times. So I think we can find ourselves somewhere on this spectrum, which puts us humans all on the same playing field. Like we all have experienced symptoms of mental health. So because we're all in the flesh and we all we're all made of the same stuff, and our biology isn't perfect, then yes, I think that we will always have mental illness until we reach heaven.
And mental illness, or even striving for better mental health.
Yeah.
I mean, read an article about how our brain should be considered, even with athletes, an equal body part. Like if your hamstring was hurt, you would go to somebody and you would work on getting your hamstring better. The same needs to be said for our brain, this active muscle in our body that's always needing work or striving to be better. So
yes. I mean, I like to think of it as like if you have, if you eat too much, your stomach is going to get sick, or you eat the wrong food, your stomach is going to get sick, and you're going to feel ill for a little bit. Well, if there's too much in the head, there's too much in the mind, and you overwhelm it and overflood it, then your mind is going to start feeling sick, and your mind is going to get ill in a sense. It's kind of like the same concept, but people don't see mental illness as that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Which is something obviously that you're hoping changes as we move on, and our awareness.
Normalize it a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. All right. So now let's focus more on the church. What is our role? Church, we're talking leaders, members, congregation. What's our role when it comes to mental illness?
Yeah. Another good, Tim, you're so good at your questions.
It's almost like I had time to think about these and write them.
Well, I feel like I want to approach this question with a lot of like humility in a way, because I don't want to just sit here as like a mental health professional and tell, like, in a sense, kind of a spiritual professional. I don't know if that term is correct, but
put that on a name tag now.
This is what you need to do to make our churches better. But
right.
I kind of want to put this one back on you too. Like, where are you seeing that like your congregation needs, like, what would you like your role to be with mental illness or with mental health?
Oh, geez. As a church leader?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, well, so where would I like? I mean, I think a networker. So knowing, I mean, right now, if people are like, hey, Tim, therapy, counseling, who do I go to? I think of you because you're one of my dear friends, and I think of the options that our church offers.
Yeah.
But I think what I would love to do is almost kind of, in a sense, be able to have an understanding of what it is and make a very unofficial assessment in my mind, diagnosis, nothing that's going to, just in my mind, be able to detail what it is, and then network, be able to refer. What I don't want is for someone to come into church and just kind of hit a brick wall, not go anywhere, not get anything, and then just turn around and leave.
Yeah.
I don't think, I mean, right now, I don't think that's us as a church. I think, networking, even just listening. Like if you were to ask me, what is our church's role? I'm thinking, listen, obviously pray for, walk with. But I do think there's a deeper level of networking. These people, there are some like actual neurological problems that a professional, now through the Holy Spirit, obviously, like, yes, somebody could come talk to me. The Holy Spirit could move through me. And then whether it's a spiritual, emotional, mental healing could take place for sure. Holy Spirit working through me. However, being able to have those resources to walk with them and kind of hand them off to somebody whose profession it is to walk with that would kind of be my desire for our role. I don't know if that's your answer or not, but.
Well, I love how your heart is like, obviously, to help people. And I would hope that that's the heart of a lot of the leaders in our church.
Which I would advocate for, yes. I would say all of the leaders, if not most, but I would say all.
Yeah, and I've been attending this church for a while, and I believe that a lot of the leaders in our church really do want to help people out. So, yeah, I think networking and connecting, I wish Grants Pass had more resources for the mental health field. But resources for the end. But if I could say that one or a few things that I would encourage the leaders in our church with, or just anybody in the church, is that the first thing is that mental illness isn't like it's not like the darkness of our society. Like I don't think
the Scarlet Letter.
Yes, I don't think mental illness is the worst thing in our society. I think that there's a lot of really hurting and broken people, and when somebody is struggling with a mental illness, like it's really painful. It is really, really difficult for that person. And I don't think that's understood by the church quite yet, that how painful and difficult that is when somebody is in like the heat of a mental illness. So any sort of training and education you can have on mental illness I think that's beautiful. Any books you can read, any articles, any TED Talks on mental illness. There's so many resources out there that I think it would even be negligent if you haven't studied about mental illness in our day and age, and especially after COVID. That being said, when somebody's sitting in front of you who's struggling with a mental illness, or who is having symptoms that their mental health has declined, I would say the first thing is try not to fix that person.
Right.
Try, like, what they really need the most is for somebody to be fully emotionally present with them and to ask questions. So learn how to ask questions about that person, about who they are, about their well-being, and try to see them more through the lens of, hey, we're both people and we're on the same playing field here, maybe struggling with different things, but and then I like to twist this and say, I think the Lord is using people with mental illness to further his kingdom in a way that people who don't have mental illness can't. And we see this throughout the Gospels, like Jesus speaking with the powerless or those outcasted in society to be the first missionaries, or to be the people that follows him, or to be the people that proclaim his name. And if we as a church are trying to fix people with mental illness, we're doing like the opposite of what Jesus did. Jesus obviously did healings, but we don't really see him try to like fix people and then say, come follow me. He just tells people to follow me as you are. So I would say stop trying to view mental illness as something that needs to change before you're okay or normal.
You said something. So Nicole taught to our high school youth group this past week. Well, you're going to have to correct me because I don't know exactly, but it was this idea of kind of opening ourselves up to our understanding of our anxiety allows God to work in the depths of our anxiety. Do you remember that quote exactly?
Yeah.
I wrote it down. I repeated it to myself, but I forgot it. So.
Yeah. Henry Nouwen is a really famous author that I love and that has helped me through some of my own mental health journey. And what he says is that that anxiety and being aware of our anxiety, that is where God does his deepest work in and through us. And that's because, Jesus, after he suffered, that is when after Jesus suffered and died, that is when he gained victory over death and over suffering. And so there's this argument in scripture that talks about, suffering being a means to victory later. And so somehow in God's way of doing things and in his kingdom, he allows the shameful things or the lowly things to then end up being victorious later. And so through Jesus and through our suffering and through Jesus' suffering, and when we identify with Christ and when he comes in our heart, he allows us to be set free from those things. And at the same time, we can learn to be more empathetic and more dependent on Jesus through that. And when we learn to be more dependent on Jesus, we have a deeper and stronger and more intimate relationship with him. And if we don't acknowledge areas that we have anxiety or suffering, then we don't get to learn that dependence on Jesus.
Right.
So somehow that paradox is shared throughout Scripture, but it's kind of hard to find at times.
Right. So if I can summarize this instruction to people of the church, from a mental health professional, have the ears to listen and the feet to walk, and then just the discernment as to yes, Lord, you want me to walk this person, as opposed to I'm in over my head. This person needs, a professional. So there's that discernment and that listening. Anything I'm forgetting? No,
I mean, I think that one of the best things you can do is listen. And as a church professional, it sounds funny. I think it is helpful to know, where's my line here?
Yeah.
At what point is this outside of my wheelhouse?
Right. And that's damaging too if you do operate outside of that, for sure.
Yeah. It is helpful to, like you're saying, network. It is helpful to refer people. Hey, I'm hearing you going through this, and this. Hey, there are people that are helpful here in walking you through this. And I, as a spiritual and church leader, want to help you through this. And I think at the same time, I don't want to hurt you further. So can I refer you to somebody who knows how to work through this professionally? And I think that is really helpful. Yeah.
All right. So speaking of listening, I know probably one frustrating part about, or maybe even sad part about your job is somebody comes in, give them instruction, give them wisdom, whatever it may be. They go out, they don't listen, and they come back, and you're kind of right where you left off. So my question to you is, what is one thing you would say to somebody who could possibly be listening, struggling, dealing with, battling a mental illness, if you knew that this is something that they would retain in their mind? What is what kind of the one big thing that you would want to send their way?
That's a good question. I think, there's two things bouncing around in my mind, and
Fine. You can say them both.
both of them are really important. And they both can sound like contradictory, but they're really important. I think personal responsibility is extremely important.
Okay.
It is so important that nobody else is responsible for your mental illness. And it's kind of like if I break my arm, I'm kind of responsible to make sure that I go to the doctor, get a cast, take care of it. And if I have a mental illness, it's my responsibility, and it's best for me to to go get help for that and to get treatment for that. And that's not a bad thing. It's actually, you can learn to be empowered as a person by working on areas of where your mental health has declined. And at the same time, I want to say you're not alone and that you are deeply loved, deeply accepted, and deeply cared for. And just because you're a person who has mental illness doesn't mean that you're worth being outcasted. In fact, I think the Lord can use you even more with this, despite how painful it is and despite how awful and low and deep it must be at times. That's not the end, and I don't think that's what the Lord has meant it to be in and of itself. I think the Lord wants to do powerful and mighty things through you if you take personal responsibility over it. So it has to have both in there, and nobody can do that for you, which can feel really alone and isolating, like, oh, I have to do this by myself. But if we're all acknowledging that and doing that together, then it's more of a community and more of a place to be shared rather than I have to do this all by myself, if that makes sense.
That was a great answer. I appreciate it. I'm not going to add anything on that because that was beautiful. Amen. So, and I know our time is kind of wrapping, we're pushing the needle to where we normally kind of end to digging deeper, but kind of what almost led me into wanting to have this conversation about mental health. I'm a big sports guy. Listeners, I think you probably know that by now. And
I remember, sorry, I have to throw this in here. Rachel told me if Tim could be a ESPN broadcaster, he totally would.
I would love it. A play-by-play announcer, I would love it.
This was when you two were engaged. She said that
well,
a long time ago.
8 years later, it is totally still the same. I would love it. So what we're seeing something that's fascinating. So I think it started, from my perception, Naomi Osaka, I think in the French Open, stepping back from the big stage to focus on her mental health, right? She felt like she was not well. She denied interviews with reporters. That was a fine against her. That kind of raised awareness. We see it in the Olympics with Simone Biles, the most elite stage in gymnasts. Like literally her whole career is built up to that moment. And she steps down from most of her events because of mental illness. In football, which is more my wheelhouse, one of the most elite receivers, kind of young, I think his third year, Calvin Ridley, in the middle of the season says, I'm stepping away, mental health. So we're seeing that more and more and more. And my question to you is why? Why or how are we seeing professional athletes like break contract, just they've decided that this is worth it. Like, this is worth my fans being disappointed. This is worth people attacking me, people that don't know me, because I need to do this. Why do you think we are seeing that?
Whew, yeah. It is kind of mind-blowing watching this happen in our athletes in the Olympics. Simone Biles was the first one that I heard of, and I was like, wow, like, that must have been a really big deal for her to do something like that. Had
to be, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of people were like, yeah, it's probably like for show. Like she probably really wasn't a thing. And I highly doubt that.
Or push through it, get over it.
Yeah,
suck it up.
Exactly. Like you're going for America here. You spent so long to try to get here. Like why? But I would love to hear your thoughts. But I guess my immediate thoughts are more revolved around how just the social media presence automatically brings a lot more anxiety and performance anxiety to the field, to our professionals, to our celebrities. And with that much more pressure, then I can imagine that once you get to like the tip of it and the peak of it, that it's just that much harder to perform well. And if she knew somebody like Simone Biles, I don't really know Naomi Osaka, but I figure that once they get there, if they know that they're not going to do well in their performance, then they know they're not going to do well in their
right,
performance.
Yeah, so it seems like there's two potential outcomes. So maybe where you're kind of defining is that the extra social media presence is creating so much more anxiety that it's bubbling over and you can't ignore it.
Yeah.
Or another route, it seems like there are more organizations and more resources that teams. So like a rookie comes in the NFL, he is going to be, all right, hey, here is a financial advisor to stop you from being broke, stop you from spending your $4.2 million a year on booze and drugs. Then I think some teams or some leagues are actually like, and here is a mental health professional, or here are resources. So it seems like there's more resources being provided that are more easy to grasp. Also, I was reading an article and they said that we're starting to see Gen Zs in elite professional positions, and that Gen Z, which is going to lead me to, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but generational awareness, that Gen Z is just so aware already that it's almost second nature to them. And so they're getting to these elite points and they're recognizing it quicker, as opposed to the people that we looked up to, Michael Jordan, maybe even like the LeBrons, Dwayne Wade's, Kobe's, maybe that just wasn't really on the forefront of their minds, where Gen Z athletes, which I think those that we have mentioned are all maybe considered Gen Z, maybe millennials, they would just be aware. So that's kind of, my unprofessional opinion. Did a little bit of reading, but there's resources and awareness.
Yeah, and there's obviously sports psychologists that travel with teams, behavioral health specialists that are probably, vying for these people. But if you've ever seen somebody like at the tip of a panic attack, or like at the finale of their mental illness, they are not functional.
Right.
So it is literally impossible for them to do something like a performance if they're that.
Well, in Simone Biles, it almost seemed like she was saying, hey, like, this is dangerous. Literally, I think she called it the twisties, which almost sounds like something you laugh at because it sounds silly.
Yeah.
But like when you are doing 3 or 4 rotations in the air, if you don't feel confident doing that, landing on your neck is a huge possibility. So she's like, this is literally like physically dangerous for me to try to perform under the stress that I'm in. So she did a good job at, like, I think on our Instagram, really making people aware, like, dog on me, but here's what I'm going through. So
yeah, and obviously in this day and age, we're encouraging people to use their voice, speak up. It's using your voice that helps overcome mental illness because you're not holding it in. And like I even think about the guy who climbed the face of the Half Dome.
Oh yeah.
And he was going to do it one day, and he decided that like he just wouldn't be able to do it. He wasn't in the mindset to do it, so he didn't, and he did it the next day and was fine. But like if you are that good at what you do and performing, when you're at your game and when you're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, totally. It's fascinating to see, and I was like, obviously you're discouraged when people are just tearing apart people they don't know, but also to see that this tennis player, I think people actually came out like, hey, we're paying your fines, like thank you so much for doing this, speaking up, raising awareness, we're covering your fines. So I think we're just seeing more of that. But speaking of resources, our time is kind of wrapping up, but I want to give this opportunity to you. 1, to say any last thoughts that you might have that we didn't get to. And 2, what are resources? Someone sitting here saying, wow, mental health, it's a thing. Is there a sermon series? Is there a book? Is there a podcast? Is there something that I could just chew on for a little bit longer? Do you have anything for them? Yeah.
As far as any last thoughts, I just can't hone in enough that the importance of intimate, healthy relationships in this day and age with us. The body of Christ needs to look like a place for connection, and I think belonging, and these are things that we all need. These are things that COVID has destroyed, and it's really, really important. I'll put a plug in for life groups. Like, get involved with people that you can have conversations with and connect with on a day-to-day level. I know that for me has been so helpful in my mental health. As far as resources go, I think we've put a plug in for this for a while, but Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, and that's by Pete Scazzaro. A great book. There's also a devotion book, Emotionally Healthy Devotion, for the office, so you can read it on your breaks or read it like at the end of the day. And that's been helpful for me. I read that at the end of the day. It's just giving you a minute or two to reflect and self-reflect, and I think that's super healthy.
That book's like an annual read probably. Like you don't just read it once and put it away. You put it on the shelf, you pick it back up at the beginning of the next year. It's a good read for sure.
Yeah. Great book. Michael Bond, the worship pastor here, he gave me a book called How We Love, and it's by Kay and Milan Yurkovich. And I'm reading that right now, and it's actually super healthy, and it's not just healthy for like personal mental health, but it's healthy for relationships. So it's like trying to see how you learned to love and how you learned to receive love as a person, and how that affects your marriage and then your family. So I'm loving that book right now. So I'll put a plug in for that. A book that I read in college that I really like, in grad school, it was Psychology, Theology, and Spirituality by Mcminn. And I really liked that book because it ties in mental health and psychology and theology. And it helps it see all those through like the same perspective, or it brings all the perspectives into one. And I think it's really important that the church knows how to integrate psychology with theology today. And I think a lot of our sermons should be, wired around the both of those. So, and then Henry Nouwen is a great author. I love reading him. I was talking about him earlier. I think he was a celibate priest, a really easy guy to read. The book that I loved from him that spoke to me was called The Wounded Healer. And that talks about how we as people in leadership position can really bridge a gap to the younger generation or to the generation that is aimless or struggling with finding a sense of purpose. So those are the 4 books I can throw out there.
So real quick, and I could be wrong, Henry Nouwen, let's get spelling on his last name. Is
Yes.
it a little odd, maybe?
Yeah, so Henry, so it's Henri, so not a Y, it's an I. And then his last name is Nouwen.
Okay.
It's not American English spelling.
Right. Just in case someone is kind of, looking up the book title is probably going to help them, but just in case someone's looking for that name. Because I remember when you had that quote up during the youth group, I was like, that's an interesting, trying to sound it out before you said the name. But awesome. Great resources. Listeners, hope you wrote those all down. Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I would say as far as counselors go, there are counselors in Grants Pass right now. There's a lot of people that do like a waiting list. If you are having trouble finding a counselor, Options for Southern Oregon, I think they do great, and I want to put a plug in for them. I know a lot of therapists there that do a great job. And I think they really care about their clients. And if you're having trouble finding somebody, you can always check in with the church office. They can refer you to people.
But if you're on a waiting list, don't give up, right? Because
Yes,
there's going to be waiting lists. Don't give up.
Be the persistent widow, the person that keeps calling.
Right. Nicole, thank you so much.
Yeah,
it was
thank
good.
you for
I feel
having
like
me.
we could have gone another hour picking your brain with certain stuff. Listeners, we will be back next year, giving you 2 weeks off so you don't have to see my face. But I promise you 2022, we'll be back. So thank you for listening. And again, Nicole, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.